we kind of need to get out more. Yeah, I think there are lots of opportunities. Yeah, Get Alive.
That'd be a good title for a book.
That might be my next book. Yeah, Get Alive.
Get Alive.
Yeah, should it be a long one or a short one?
I'd say short.
Yeah,
please.
Yeah, really.
Footnotes.
Okay. I'll work on that.
That's all I got, I'm afraid. Yeah. That was a bit sweary as well.
I thought you were fighting off excruciating boredom.
This is Professor Douglas Campbell. What is it? Professor of New Testament, Duke
Professor
University.
of New Testament, yes. They are desperate these days.
Yeah, I mean,
I know.
Obviously.
I know.
And
yeah, I feel bad about that.
Yeah, you're involved in prison ministry.
Yes.
Which I think we're going to hear a little bit about later on.
Yeah.
And what else? What have I forgotten?
You've got an
awesome wife.
Married to a gorgeous girl. Yeah, called Rachel. 2 great kids. One of whom is living in China with his new wife. That's about it, really.
Yeah.
Like cats, dogs. This is Dr. Chris Tilling, who is a great buddy of mine, an extremely promising young scholar. I think principally because he married an incredible German girl as well.
Very true.
Yeah, so you speak very good German.
Oh yeah.
I'm a little bit jealous of that.
Yeah. Well, that's nice.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Something there for me to hang on
right.
to.
He's written a key book on Paul's Divine Christology, which you should all buy. And and I'm also very jealous of the fact that you live in London and work at my old college, King's College London. I really miss London. So Chris is well positioned. So he's teaching in St. Mellitus College, which is partly supported by Holy Trinity Brompton and partly supported by the Church of England. So you have your finger on the pulse of a lot of very important kind of Christian stuff, I think.
Yeah. I didn't say anything about your books.
And he's very good at chess.
Talking to them.
He's very, very good at chess. He's a tactical mastermind.
Mastermind.
That's right, which is why he understands me.
Yes, I'm pretending, of course. I feel threatened by him, so I just nod.
Chris does understand me. Chris is the one.
I'll be honest, it took me a while before I understood Douglas's work. I read his quest for Paul's Gospel, that's what it's called, wasn't it?
That's
quest
right,
for Paul's Gospel.
Which you didn't understand.
I didn't get it then. And I read it and I reviewed it on my blog and we had a little conversation and it was clear it wasn't going anywhere. So I thought I'd pick it up again and I read The Deliverance of God. Then things started to slowly move into place. But the thing with Deliverance of God is that he's doing things with politics, he's doing things with philosophy and sociology and exegesis and history and language and semiotics, and all of this is thrown into the mix. And it can be really quite challenging to juggle the balls. And I think I read Deliverance of God about 3 times before, and now it was very clear exactly what was going on.
You've read it more than I have, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, I get it.
But you actually said something interesting at one point, which was you wouldn't have understood Deliverance without Quest. And you didn't understand Quest without Deliverance. So then it was like a 1-2 punch, and then you kind of got it. Yeah. Thank you for doing all that hard work, by the way. How many other people understand it?
I find that I teach most of the time St. Mellitus College ordinands. We don't only teach ordinands. A lot of independent students just doing undergraduate degrees, but I find those engaged in Christian ministry tend to get it.
Yeah. It's actually quite practical.
Yeah.
Yeah, when the rubber meets the road, when you're dealing with people and engaging with them rather than theorizing about them in the classroom, it gives you categories that will work for you.
Absolutely.
That's the idea anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps maybe it should have been just a little bit shorter then.
I'm sure a lot of people would agree with that statement.
Yeah. I had issues.
What was the penny drop moment for you?
Oh, like right back?
Yeah.
For Deliverance? Good question. It was actually not long after grad school. So my head was filled with Longnecker, Richard Longnecker.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, who's just a brilliant Pauline scholar, a brilliant guy.
Book's just been re-released.
Yeah.
By the way.
Paul, Apostle of Liberty, wonderful book. And Longacre was a very eclectic thinker, and he was very sensitive to Judaism. So he laid out all these questions. He was very sensitive to Sanders' agenda, very evangelical. So all of these things were laid out for us at the table. We went through grad school, and we knew we had to be sensitive to Judaism. We knew we had to be nuanced about that without realizing how revolutionary this was. But Longacre never resolved anything. He was a very organic sort of, I reckon he read the rabbis too much, because we used to ask him, there are three options here, which one is it? And he would say, oh, I really think it's probably all three. And that just did not satisfy me. So I was a little bit confused. So I went back to Otago, University of Otago in New Zealand, on my first teaching post. I was also under pressure, really theologically. I felt like my biblical understanding was too rigid. It was beginning to fracture. And that's when I met Alan Torrance. And so Alan starts feeding me little essays about the Cappadocians and about Athanasius and Arius, and then feeds me this essay by his dad, Covenant or Contract.
Yeah.
And that lays out the two big approaches to salvation. Is it conditional? Do I satisfy a condition, get saved? Is it unconditional? Do I get saved by grace? Is it grace all the way down? Is God legal or is God loving? Is God something to do with justice, or is God something to do with the family? And I went, boom, these are the categories that explain everything I've been struggling with. I need to write a book about this. That was in 1991.
And those essays, they are in the book.
They're in the book.
They're in the book.
Life-changing
Republished.
essays. Those essays changed my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Saddens me when people read them actually and don't have their lives changed. They come back and they read it, it's about Presbyterianism. I say, you've just missed the point. This is about God. This is about what sort of God we worship.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's important.
That's
reasonably important.
That is what ultimately your book is most revolutionary in this, because it's addressing the question, who is God for us?
Right.
And answering that question with utter clarity.
Right. Let's be clear about it, because it's quite an important question. And most of us aren't clear about it. And most of us read Paul in a way that confuses that.
Yeah.
And he was not confused about that. We have made him confused. That's the great tragedy of our time, I think. Yeah. The Babylonian captivity of Paul.
Yeah.
He's been captured. It's not just liberals, it's conservatives get this wrong as well.
So give me an example. So I'm sorry guys, I'm just going ahead with this here, but give me an example of a reading which has turned Paul into a confused thinker.
Oh, we'll take something like the four spiritual laws, right? Which are based on the Roman Road. So the Roman Road is law 2, 3, 4. And Bill Bright said he felt it was all a little bit negative, so he decided to put law 1 in, which is God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, which is totally right.
Yeah.
But only he had stopped at the end of law 1. But then he goes on and goes, nevertheless, law 2, he's going to kill you, right? Because you've sinned, because you've like got parking tickets and you've exceeded the speed limit and stuff like that. And then he's going to kill his son instead, right? The guns of wrath will be turned onto Jesus. Boom. And now you're okay. Provided you do the things you need to do. Otherwise, you have a bad day, you're screwed as well. Yeah. Right, that's a bad reading of Paul. Now, if you think Paul thinks that for part of a letter, and then he goes, but God really loves you all the way down. He loves you so much, he's going to send his son to die for you unconditionally. That is a guy who's seriously confused about God.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a problem. Secondly, which one do you want it to be?
Yeah.
Right?
A fact of the matter is, when I teach on Paul, I would say over 90% of the time, the way you just summarised the gospel for Paul, is this sort of contractual, conditional.
Yeah.
That's what people associate with Paul and the gospel.
Yeah.
Imagine preaching the gospel in church on the basis of Paul's letters. That's what most will come up with in
and
a
he's
summary.
Alienated people. That reading of Paul has alienated generations. I mean, it's alienating the youth because it's so politically inflexible and cruel. And we have young people running around now, and they care about people. They care about the environment. They want to do something about racism, inequality, all this kind of stuff. And Paul comes across as this kind of very kind of establishment figure, which of course is exactly what he wasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy running around the Roman world causing a heck of a lot of trouble. He was like the Che Guevara of the ancient world. Well, I mean that in a positive way. I know that image is a little bit sketchy.
Yeah, this ties in with one of the things you're most passionate about. One of the key issues that I learned when I was engaging with your work, and as I've been doing some thinking afterwards, is that justice, I can't assume what that means. Justice isn't one thing. A lot of people will say, we need to understand Paul in forensic and covenantal terms, and use all of these categories without sufficiently thinking about what those categories actually mean. And I must admit, I think many will assume that when we're talking about Paul and justice and forensic, that we're dealing with what we would call retributive justice. That, you know, for sin to be dealt with, there needs to be punishment, and then of course forgiveness needs to take place and all of the rest of it. But what you've shown is that in Paul, there's a forensic element to Paul, but it's something quite different. A liberative notion of justice is in play, which corresponds with Paul's language most of the time, doesn't it, really? Because Paul is speaking about not sin in terms of guilt and punishment, but sin as something which enslaves together with all of the other evil powers, and from which we need to be set free. So this renewed image of justice is something that's also motivated what you do in prison ministry, and I'd love to hear how you join the dots here. How your understanding of Paul has helped shape what you actually do in real people's lives where it really matters.
Well, I have a slightly embarrassing confession to make, which is I was doing all this stuff in Paul, and I knew where it went politically, and I knew what the implications were, but the work in prison started because of an incident in my son's life with a friend of his, and my wife getting alongside this kid, kind of literally getting woken in the night and told to write to him in prison where he was being held prior to his trial. And I was rather reluctant. I was too kind of self-involved to get really engaged alongside her. But after a couple of years, really, she pulled me in, or months, she pulled me in, and I got through that kind of fear barrier that you have visiting maximum security prisons and whatnot, and became more and more fascinated by it. And immediately, what I was working on with Paul took on a very, very biting existential and political relevance. I'll tell you something interesting. I could spend a semester working on Romans with my very smart, but maybe too smart students at Duke, and they would sit there politely, and it was hard going, and I would lay out the options, and maybe 3/4 of the way through the semester, half of them would go, I kind of get it, maybe you're right with this new approach to Romans, and half of them would politely agree with me and then continue in their own way. In the prison course, we would visit a prison, and those kids got what I was trying to say about Romans and Paul in about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Just like that, bang. I didn't have to convince them, they just got it. Which means it's all about how you relate to people who are struggling, who have made a mistake and done something wrong. Do you look at them with eyes of compassion, or do you look at them with punitive eyes?
Yeah.
Do you look at people with empathy, or do you look at people in a way that kind of others them? And it's just broken that whole thing open. And it has remained pressing politically. I get a little bit frustrated by the kind of nonsense that's said about this book. I'm tempted to kind of just walk away, but every time I do, something happens with mass incarceration that draws me back and reminds me, this is actually really important. This is a battle we have to have, and this is a battle we have to win.
Yeah.
So 2 months ago in this city, a student of theology who has given her life to Christ, has repented, has sustained and walked other people around her through suicide attempts. This is a woman who was just remarkable. 2 months ago, the state of Georgia says, over the top of the pleas of her children, we're going to kill you because this is the just thing to do. And they do. And they kill her. there's just something so wrong about that. And yet the Bible and justice and God and Jesus are used to underwrite it. So there's something very, very wrong with the way we're using the Bible and God and justice and Jesus. And a lot of it goes back to this battle over Paul.
Yeah.
It really goes back to Romans. It goes back to which bit of Romans are you reading and how are you reading it. Yeah? So this stuff really matters.
Yeah.
It really does matter. Biblical scholars are accountable for how they handle this stuff. Will be held accountable. Not being retributive and punitive, I'm just saying, Jesus loves you, but when you show up and he says, how did you handle all that stuff? It's going to be embarrassing for some folks. Imagine that. I think you're in trouble, actually, Chris.
I've been
wanting to help you. There are a few things.
At the moment.
Yeah, there are a few things I wanted to talk to you about. Yeah, just so that goes better for you.
Thank
that
you
moment.
Very much.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know what to ask now.
I think that theology is difficult. And the theological categories that as Christians we're asked to use and indwell are profoundly countercultural and counterintuitive. And so the idea that you can pick up a text and the key theological issues will just emerge out of them if you're sitting there doing good lexicographical work, this is absurd. We only bring out of a text, particularly we actually only get out of a text what we bring to it. If we don't bring certain possibilities to the text, we won't see them, even if they're possibilities. So a theological education is actually crucial to understanding somebody like Paul correctly. Understanding anything in the New Testament, you got some brilliant theological minds at work there. My goodness me. Paul is one of the sharpest. So those theological categories are very, very important. You do have to be careful not to step over into anachronism, sure. But judging what an anachronism is depends to a certain extent on whether you trust your theological account of reality. Having said that, it does matter a heck of a lot which theologians you're reading.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think the Cappadocians are really the way to go. And I think the Torrance is the way to go, and I think Bard is the way to go. I think a certain reading of Calvin is the way to go. I think Irenaeus is the way to go. I think these guys are all saying the same thing.
The Irenaean principle, God is only known through God. And Athanasius, God has manifested himself in the flesh in these last days, and that means that we can forsake idols because of the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. Or Kierkegaard and Barth and this whole tradition emphasize the freedom of God in revelation in the person of Jesus Christ. And this is where the rubber hits the road. When we're reading Paul, we're not just excavating these ancient texts. We're not just talking about ancient ideas, doing archaeology with lexemes. We're talking about God. And that means these issues are inevitably in play, whether we like it or not.
The living God.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're talking about somebody for whom God was very much alive.
Yeah.
And our God is very much alive, and it's the same God. So that makes it a heck of a lot more interesting as a conversation.
Yeah.
Right. But how do we know what that God is like? Because the crucial mistake that I think Barth was very clear about is the mistake when we confuse our culture with our God. It's when we start to get in the way and make assertions about where we're located. Bible calls it idolatry. And Barth saw very, very clearly that the only way to forestall that inevitable spiral into sin and distortion was by attending very closely to Jesus Christ. That's the point at which God has been definitively revealed.
And to tie this back to what you said earlier on about justice, and is God punitive or is God compassionate or not?
Brilliant, man.
And there's a sense in which what you're doing with regards to justice is so that the state of Georgia is executed because it's the just thing to do. And what we're doing there, you're saying, is we're just projecting that onto God, exactly as idolatry does.
Yeah,
we've projected our human notions of what justice
It's an act of
God.
idolatry. That's exactly right. It's an act of idolatry. True justice is defined by Jesus Christ. You think about justice in the light of Christ, you don't think about it the other way around, which is what we've done. We've actually inserted our justice into the being of God, which is a huge problem.
Yeah. That's what needs to be revealed in the gospel.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So, all of which is to say, all of this stuff is pretty friggin' dynamic.
Yeah.
It's got real-world consequences.
Yeah.
We should all be, this is my latest thing, we actually need to be scholar activists. We need to be realizing that the Bible, as we read it correctly, is going to push us out into constituencies to act like the people in the Bible. I mean, you can't just read about them. If you're just sitting in your study, reading about them, something's gone wrong. You're not really reading it. But if you're really opening yourself up to the Bible, I think stuff is going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that would be good. I think it would be great if more Bible scholars were Bible activists. For example, try thinking about a letter written from a prison after you've spent some time in a prison. Just go and visit a prison a bit. And all of a sudden, you will realize you've been thinking about this in a completely artificial way. There are all these very practical things that happen in prisons when you're writing that would just never occur to you if you're sitting in a comfortable little study. Once you get out there, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, of course.
Give me an example of that when it comes to reading Paul.
Yeah.
Because I think that, because Paul writing from prison.
Yeah, well, I think he wrote 10 letters,
Dikaio.
right? Yeah.
That
totally,
verb.
I know. This is a guy that's been locked up. He's locked up in every state that he goes to. He's scourged for bringing the gospel of Christ to areas. He's beaten with rods. He's interrogated. And we think he's on the side of the man. This is crazy. If you're reading Galatians 3, attuned to prison dynamics, prisons are where you get locked up before some upper class guy who's corrupt decides whether you're going to live or die. And in that situation, we get the verb dikaio, translated justify, which makes no sense. What does it mean in that location? It means getting set free. It means getting released. It means getting out of jail, getting out of the dark, getting out of the stench and the stink, getting out of the fear for your life, getting out from underneath the threat of death. That's what it means. Yeah. So we shouldn't really translate it, justify. I mean, I didn't even know what justify means. Yeah, to be taught by a teacher who actually wants to treat the Jews as human beings who are nice is a huge gift. And as is becoming increasingly evident, if you other the Jews in your interpretation, you're not going to have any trouble othering anybody else. If you other anybody else, you're not going to have any trouble with othering the Jews. And I don't like using the language of otherness a lot because it's kind of trendy and fuzzy, but I actually think it names a truth. It names a truth which is playing out as we speak with very powerful and important real-world consequences as we talk about refugees. And you watch what a lot of our leaders are doing is radical othering of people who should not be othered. They're human beings with problems and trouble that we should be compassionately getting alongside as Christians. So, yeah, all of this stuff is tied up together. But I think, to be honest, you can't read about othering in the end of the day and really change it. You've got to engage. You've got to go to a space, possibly where people are a little bit different from you, where you might be a little intimidated and anxious. You've got to go face to face with the people that you're worried about. And then the magic of kind of human relating is that we empathize, we get it, we literally look in their faces and read the pain that they're in. And that draws us in and we realize, hey, these are people like me. They don't look like me, but they are like me. They struggle, they suffer, they have issues, and my duty is to love them, not to hate them and exclude them. So practical face-to-face stuff is really, really important. We find 101 different ways of mitigating and postponing the reality of God so that we don't have to be responsible to what he's asking us to do. So one of the ways we do this is we push the Christ event into the future and sort of create this space where it's like, like maybe 15% of it is working for us. Otherwise we're back, left to our own devices struggling away and God's expectations aren't too high for us. But think about that just for a moment. Is the Holy Spirit at work amongst us or not? Yes or no? I have my doubts about you, but... Okay. I've noticed good things. Okay, so is the Holy Spirit here? Yes or no? Yeah, okay, that's God, right? So, I mean, how much is left over? How much is left out of that you still kind of need? If God's really here. I mean, are you seriously under-resourced? How much do we postpone if God is really here? We postpone too much. God really is showing up. We're just not listening. We're not listening to the music.
He's been reading Colossians, I reckon, this guy.
I have read it once or twice. Yeah. I like it. Yeah.
It was alright.
Yeah, it's a good letter.
Please don't.
Prison letter.
That one on.
Prison letter.
It's alright.
Prison letter.
But Paul didn't write it, though, surely.
Yeah. Paul wrote it. Paul's most important letter is Ephesians.
Really?
Yeah.
Paul's.
It wasn't written to Ephesus, though.
Yeah, this is framing Paul.
Yeah, how'd you come around to that?
Well, because he was in prison. Whenever you're in prison in a Roman situation, you don't know if you're going to live or die. So he hears about a bunch of converts, probably associated with the synagogue in Laodicea. He's in prison somewhere to the east of Colossae, probably not very far away. Who knows? He's in the cell. Cells were usually dark. They're like a hole. They actually had legislation, like our legislation, saying you deserve half an hour of exercise a day. Otherwise, you're in there locked up. What do you do in the dark if you're Paul and you're locked up for 3 months? And you hear about a group of Christians that don't know the gospel because they haven't been evangelized by you or by one of your proxies. You give them the good stuff. You give them your manifesto. You lay out the Pauline account of what Christianity is all about. That's what the letter to Ephesians is. Yeah. So for quite practical reasons, I think that's when he really crafted his gospel and laid it out. And it's a pretty good text, isn't it?
It sure
it's got a few good things to say. Yeah, it's very inclusive. It's very kind of Calvinist, very Bartian.
Yeah, very
quite a Bartian letter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to come back on the whole reception of your work, given that there's going to be a whole bunch of people watching this and they will have read snippets in Tom Wright's books. They would have seen a few articles floating around online that seem to be really quite vigorously dismissive of the deliverance of God. And what are the most important misunderstandings, do you think, of the deliverance of God? And I'm asking this, the very motive behind Beyond Old and New Perspectives on Paul were the reviews that I'd read. I couldn't believe what I was reading, so frankly, in the journal articles. So I thought we need to get a team together and sit Doug down and ask him some questions and make sure that we've understood each other. You know, that was the motive behind Beyond Old and New Perspectives on Paul.
Well, it came out at some conferences, didn't it?
That's right.
Where you kind of made that happen. We got some pretty seriously good scholars to work me over and see how that would play out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there was some really good stuff, good conversations took place. But what do you see as some of the most important misunderstandings, still, of your work? And how do you respond to them? Yeah. I mean, you do some of that, of course, in the book, but in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's a good question. There are two main objections to what I'm doing with my rereading. My rereading is, what it does is it traces a kind of an architecture of a problem, and it drills down through that and eventually says, pretty much all this damage is being done by a particular reading of Romans 1-3, which, cutting a long story short, assumes that Paul himself is doing what we call laying a foundation, undertaking a theologically foundationalist argument. So he's, for example, he's committed to Romans 1. He's arguing a little bit like Thomas Aquinas. So this is the move that I'm pushing back on. And I'm reading this really as more of a Bardian, going, if Paul was a Bardian as he is everywhere else I read him, what else could be going on here? And I realized, I just woke up one morning and thought, heck, the whole thing is Socratic. Boom. Gotta be Socratic. Read it through and I thought, well, that actually makes quite good sense of the text. Makes really nice sense of the text to read this Socratically. So I write a big book about it. But it's unusual. It's different. People are pushing back on it because a lot is at stake. So what do they say? They say two things. They say, first of all, I don't think your Socratic reading is possible because the Romans could never have understood it. Fascinating. Terrible objection, right? Because they're not ancient Romans. And the sorts of cues that you give when you're doing slightly ironic, parodic speech are so subtle that the only people that will get that are people who inhabit that culture. Parody, as soon as you shift it outside of its home culture, is lost, it's dissipated. So the only way you would know whether or not this was a parodic element in a text is if you were one of those people. Now, my critics are good enough scholars to know that they're kind of faking it here, I would have thought. And they're substituting in, this is classic, this is Daniel Kaufman, thinking fast, thinking slow. This is classic cognitive behavior. If I can't answer a difficult question, I'll answer a slightly easier one that sounds the same. So when my critics say ancient Romans never would have heard this text, what they're really saying is, I never heard this text this way. Which I totally understand. I totally understand that, but it's a terrible objection. That's why we do historical critical work. I never say you can read this text and just get it straight away as a Socratic argument. That's too much. I say after a lot of study, looking at all the problems and the cues, suddenly you go, oh yeah, that'll work. I think that's a bad objection, saying what the ancient Romans would have heard. I think it's especially bad given that Paul sent people with this letter who had read it out to him, whom he had told, this is a Socratic argument. So you can imagine the Romans getting to the end of chapter 3. Oh, we're having problems here, Paul. We can't tell if you're Thomas Aquinas setting up, the key part of the Summa Theologica, or whether you're actually more like Kierkegaard and setting up a Socratic argument. A lot rests on this, Paul. A lot's at stake here with the future of church theology and history. Help us out. Which one is it? And Phoebe goes, it's Kierkegaard. Move on. All right? End of the problem. Okay, so this is a bad objection. Second objection is nobody does it. When Campbell sets up this reading and gets this theory, and this theory does all this damage and creates a punitive God and a God of penal substitution, all of that stuff that's laid out and all the problems that flow from it, he's just making stuff up. That is disproved about once a week in my teaching at Duke when a student comes to my office, often slightly tearfully, and says, you've just summarized my life. Mm-hmm. It's also nicely disproved by John Piper, who wrote this cute little book, The Future of Justification, after I had written and locked Deliverance of God, locked it, in which I said, this is the theory, the architecture of the model I'm going after and the reading I'm going after. Here it is. Here are the propositions. So I picked up Piper's book and I thought, this will be interesting. I'm either totally screwed at this moment or I got it. Go through the book. Every single proposition, claim, and the whole model right there, black and white. That's not a straw man. If John Piper is for it, it is not a straw man, right? I rest my case with John Piper. I don't often praise him quite so extensively, but in this particular instance, he did a great job. Great job. And, the bookstore's got a couple of others down there now, isn't it? Tom Schreiner's brought one out, Simon Gathercole's brought one out, Steve Westerholm's brought one out. All these straw men that I go after are showing up in other books. Yeah, it's tiring. Yeah. It's tedious, isn't it? We need something different, please. Pauline scholars out there, give me something different on Paul, apart from the Lutheran reading. That's your job, Chris. That's your
a new reading.
Yeah, I'm handing that on to you.
That's no problem. I've got a little book on Paul in the pipeline. One of the things I've experienced in teaching Paul, I get particularly animated on certain subjects because I can see in students' eyes penny drop moments, aha moments, where they're starting to see something in a completely different light, where something that they previously assumed was totally Paul has just been taken away from them, but in a really good way, where something else is given back. And those moments I want to be able to capture in a shortish book. I'm thinking about doing something on early Christology as well. There's a whole load of things in the pipeline at the moment. Daniel Kirk is writing something, and Brian Pittra, and I've got my own views on some of these things. So I'm going to let their work settle a little bit, and then I'll write in the light of that. But mainly I'm concerned about Christology.
But you're a player at that. You really are a big player already, I think, in the Christology stuff.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well,
Take your place at the table.
Christology is what I'm most passionate about, which I think is one reason why I keyed into what Doug is doing pretty quickly. Because I was showing in my own work on Paul that Jesus Christ, it really is all about Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the heart and centre of the Apostle Paul's writing. If you don't get the magnanimity, magnanimity, thank you, of Jesus Christ in the pages of Paul's letters, then you've just missed the heartbeat completely. And I think this then cued me in to see what Doug was doing by seeing it's such I'd say apocalyptic readings of Paul, at least when they're put in Douglas's tone of voice. It really is about putting Jesus Christ at the centre of it all. That's what it means. It isn't about reading Paul in light of an apocalyptic worldview or simply in light of apocalyptic literature, as if this theology of Jewish apocalyptic frames everything that Paul does. That has a part to play, but it is ultimately apocalyptic readings of Paul. It's about putting Jesus Christ front, centre and middle of reading Paul, which is why it's right and why other readings of Paul
because you didn't know about that before it happened. Right, before Jesus shows up and he's the Son of God, he's God incarnate. It's not like people walking around saying, well, Jesus is going to show up at any moment, surely. This is the Son of God incarnate. This has got to be, this is a new thing when God shows up in person. So the claim that apocalyptic people make, that something new has happened, is right in the heart of the Christian faith, in the heart of the creeds. God from God, light from light.
So how do you respond then to because this is big at the moment, isn't it? This has come out in Tom Wright's work.
It's just misrepresentation. It's just kicking up dust.
Right, Paul and his recent interpreters, and in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, he says, look, you are just saying that the entire backstory of Israel is wiped off the table. It's this novum coming out of nowhere. It's
just not true.
And so how do you respond to that? What are you doing?
It's just not true. I spelled all this out a long time ago in a panel at SBL 2002 with Lou Martin. It's a point technically about epistemology. What's new is your understanding of God. You can't understand what God is about until Jesus shows up. Then you get the full picture. In the light of that full picture, you reevaluate everything. But what you have to do is you reevaluate your antecedents and you see the continuities that you couldn't see before. It's not rocket science. Good segue. Chess master.
There you go.
He's tactically very sophisticated.
That was the queenside flank manoeuvre there.
I thought it was the flying tiger, the double tiger attack.
The Hurtado attack?
The Hurtado attack. No. That's a weak attack. It's like...
Yeah.